Hi everyone, my name is Myisha and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Philosophy here at Harvard. And I would like to welcome you all to Transcending the Tower, a panel on the emotions and writing for the public. Before I invite Myisha to introduce our speakers, I would like to thank the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Interfaculty Initiative and Andrea and Kimberly for supporting us in our programming. If you're a graduate student working in MBB topics and want to be more involved in the MBB initiative, you should find us at the reception. With that, let me introduce Myisha Cherry, our host for tonight's event. Myisha is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. We have been blessed with her presence on this campus, first as a fellow at the Safra Center, and now as a Santayana Fellow at the Department of Philosophy. She will be joining UC Irvine as faculty in the Department of Philosophy there.
Riverside.
Sorry, UC Riverside. Myisha's work is on moral psychology and social and political philosophy. She has edited a volume on the moral psychology of anger and has a forthcoming book called Unmuted: Conversations on Prejudice, State Violence, Oppression, and Social Justice. She has also become known for her public writing at the LA Times, The Salon, and Huffington Post. She hosts a popular podcast called the Unmute Podcast and has been featured on BET and TEDx, among other platforms. So let's welcome Myisha with a warm applause, who will introduce her speaker. Thank you.
So I also want to thank the organizers for bringing us together. I'll also like to thank you all for coming out tonight to partake in a discussion about the emotions and writing for the public, which is two of my favorite topics. From emotional intelligence to the science of happiness, the moral psychology of anger, and the philosophy of love, scholars across disciplines have been interested in the nature, role, and impact of emotions in our private and political lives. Tonight, a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a psychologist walk into a bar, and I'm just like, sit down to discuss some of our research and ideas on emotions and attitudes, as well as how and why we transcend the tower by making our academic work accessible to the general public. In doing so, we hope that we can provide some insight on how the audience can do the same. So joining me this evening is Lisa Feldman-Barrett. Lisa is a University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University. The Wall Street Journal describes her latest book, How Emotions Are Made, as a thought-provoking journey into emotion science. She has given public talks for TED, and not the X, like the official TED, and Wired, I'm so jealous, and her expertise on emotions has been sought by the FBI and Congress. Her expertise, not her, has been sought out by FBI and Congress. And then we also have Ryan Enos, who is an associate professor of government here at Harvard. His book, The Space Between Us, has been described, quote, as a rigorous and insightful book that will change how you see the world and your place in it. His research, which is at the intersection of politics, geography, and psychology, has been featured in the Washington Post, Vox, The Economist, and the Boston Globe. Let's welcome our panelists. So I want to kind of structure it like so. I want to first spend the first half of our discussion discussing your research. And then I want to spend the second half discussing how, why, and the lessons learned in taking that research to the general public. So I want to begin with you first, Lisa. In chapter 2 of your book, How Emotions Are Made, you write, quote, "Our emotions aren't built in, waiting to be revealed. They are made, period, by us, period," end quote. And this kind of thinking flies against all of our common understanding of how emotions are and what emotions are, and you call this the classical view. So I want you to describe for us, why is the classical view so unconvincing to you, and why should we be convinced that emotions are instead made by us?
Well, I'm impressed that you quoted a specific set of lines in my book. They sound really much better when you read them that way, though, with the drama. So that would convince me, actually, just your reading of it. But here's the thing. If I wasn't a scientist and I didn't run experiments, and I didn't read, literally at this point, thousands of experimental papers, I probably wouldn't be convinced.
Right.
Because emotions feel like they happen to us. And throughout history, that's how scholars have written about them. You know, that there's something that happened to us, that we have these, you know, the modern take would be you have some kind of ancient part of your brain, and lurking in that ancient part is this inner beast, you know, of emotions, which when triggered will cause you to do and say all kinds of things that you would rather not, that have a specific facial expression that everyone around the world makes and recognizes, you know. So when your anger circuit is tripped, you scowl. Everyone can recognize that scowl as an emotion. You have a bodily pattern that your body takes on during anger. And of course, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but only a very little bit, actually. That really, more or less, is the classical view. And what convinces me that it's wrong is the data, I guess. So in the history of science, science always starts with common sense ideas. We experience the world and ourselves and other people through the lens of our own eyes, more or less. And so, you know, we always start off with these naive realist views of the world and how it works, right? So it looks like the sun moves across the sky from morning to night, and so we started off with a view of the solar system as one where the sun revolves around the Earth. And you know, we know that's not true now, after hundreds and maybe some people might even say thousands of years. So I think in much the same way, we start off with the theory of emotion that's really been around with us, I would say, since ancient Greece, more or less. And that view is based on our own common sense understanding of what it feels like to experience emotion and what it feels like to look at someone else experience emotion. And this is a very Western view, I should say, right? So there are some cultures in the world that don't even distinguish between thoughts and feelings. So the idea that we have some kind of inner beast that's has to be tamed by our rationality is a very Western view. But it's a view that when you carefully look at the data, regardless of whether you're looking at people's faces or their bodies or their brains, just doesn't, there's no aspect of it which rings true in the scientific evidence.
A very interesting example that you use. So I was a fan of the sitcom, the series Lie to Me. And it's basically about a guy who's able to read people's faces, their facial expressions, and he comes to the conclusion if they're lying or not. And one of the reasons why I also like the series is they just constantly talk about the emotions. And when you enter into his office, around the hallway, they have the kind of a traditional classical faces of what the emotions look like, right? So you have like the angry face, the fearful face. So all last year, you know, just to inspire my work when I walked into my office, I had those pictures of like the angry face, the fearful face, being that I work on the emotions. And it's like now, after having read your work, I feel like I'm totally wrong.
It's okay.
Feel like when I send emojis, you know, that's not sufficient. I'm doing something wrong. So so describe a little bit for us why the angry face that we thought was the angry face could be some other things, and the feeling that we thought we had in our gut probably is not fear, but it's something else.
Sure. So, I mean, emojis might be a nice place to start. You know, we just finished a set of experiments where we wanted to see, do people actually understand emojis to be to signify the emotion that they were intended to? And they completely don't. I mean, basically, if you don't have text with an emoji, other than a smiling face, people read all kinds of interpretations into that emoji. So I'm not saying emojis actually aren't useful with text or with a picture or with a photograph or some other, context to disambiguate it. But the same thing is true of faces. So I wouldn't call it an angry face. I would call it a scowling face. And I would say, here's the thing, in this culture, and largely speaking in urbanized cultures around the world, and I'm using that very specifically because what I'm about to say is not true for remote cultures. In urbanized cultures, and more in the Western world than in other parts of the world, a scowling face is thought to be the facial expression of anger. A pouting, kind of frowny face is thought to be the facial expression of sadness. A smiling face is thought to be the facial expression of happiness, and so on and so forth. In order for that to be true, two things have to hold. People have to consistently scowl when they're angry, and that's consistency, right? And they also have to not scowl when they're not angry, which would be specificity. So you really need to have both in order to make the reverse inference that when someone's scowling, they're angry. So if you look at the data, and I'll just say, 4 other colleagues and I just spent a year and a half reviewing thousands of studies from babies, from adults in various cultures, from people who are congenitally blind, congenitally deaf, primates, and so on, non-human primates. Here's what you see. What you see is that on average, people, when they're angry, scowl about 20 to 25% of the time. And they scowl also at many other times, when they're sad, when they're afraid, when they're disgusted, and even when they're not angry at all. So for example, I'm just to say as an aside, I always use this example, but actually my husband's here today, so it's the first time I've ever used this example with him actually sitting in the audience, so I'm feeling a little bit of stress here. He makes a full-on scowl when he's concentrating really hard. Right? Yeah. And so when I was the first time I decided to use this as an example with my graduate students, they all sort of collectively breathed a sigh of relief, because apparently I also scowl when I'm concentrating really hard. And so for years, they have to sit in front of me as they are giving presentations in the lab while I'm scowling at them, right? And it was a big laugh, and it makes a good story, but in the moment it was incredibly stressful for them, actually, because they assumed, that I was displeased when in fact I was just concentrating really hard. The point is that it feels to you like you read emotion in the face, the way you read words on a page. That is actually not what your brain is doing, and we talk about body movements as if they're body language, but your body actually doesn't have a language. And this is particularly problematic when you think about how facial movements are, the interpretations they're given, where there's some impact on people's lives, like in a courtroom. Or in a,
we're gonna get to that.
Yeah, or where there are gender differences in how faces are interpreted. So, but my point is that there is no set of facial movements that is specific and consistent enough that you could call it a facial expression of an emotion. Does sometimes scowling express emotion? Yeah, of course. I mean, just anger? Sure. But it often doesn't. And in fact, you as a perceiver, even though to you it's the experience, like right now we're talking to each other and it seems like we're just focusing on each other's faces. Mm-hmm. But our brains are actually capturing a tremendous amount of information as a pattern, including what our voices sound like, what the temperature is, even what's going on inside your body actually influences not only how you interpret what you see, but literally what you see sometimes. So no matter how confident you feel, you are guessing, and you can be wrong.
Right. So we don't really know how people are feeling.
No, we don't. Okay. We sometimes feel like we know, but we don't. Yeah.
One small question. It may not seem relevant, but explain resting bitch face for us.
Yeah, it's totally relevant. And I mean, as a scientist, this is just one of those moments where you think, if I had to make this stuff up, it couldn't be any better, right? So people, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with visual illusions, right? So that's where, for example, the Kinesa square, where you have 4 dark Pac-Man face, like like a Pac-Man, it's like a circle with a piece cut out of it, and then in the middle there's nothing, and it looks like there's a square when in fact there really isn't. You're just seeing it. So resting bitch face is when there's a structurally neutral face. So when we actually can measure the facial muscle movements in the face, and the face is actually at rest, there's no expression, but people look at the face and they perceive the woman, usually, it's sometimes a man, but usually it's a woman, to be really angry and harsh and aggressive. And it can arise from a couple of reasons. There are basically 3 kinds of reasons that you can see, where people see resting bitch face, where it's just a structurally neutral face at rest. One is that some people have, all of us have structural features to our faces. So some of us have rounder faces, some of us have longer faces. There's a sort of an anatomy to how the muscles insert on the face. And so some people, when their face is at rest, they just look a little bit more like they're scowling, even though their face is actually biologically just at rest. So that's one reason. A second reason is if you're in a negative mood, you are more likely to see a resting face as scowling, than if you are in some other kind of mood, like in neutral mood or in a positive mood. So for example, when we, in our lab, manipulate people's mood without their awareness, they will see a completely neutral face and we make them feel unpleasant. They see that face as less trustworthy, less competent, less attractive, less likable, and the converse when we make them feel pleasant. And then the third cause of resting bitch face is when we see, again, usually a woman, in a context either where she's being very assertive, even if it's role appropriate to be assertive, right, where she's being very assertive, or she has a history of being assertive, let's say, then when her face is at rest, it's often perceived as being angry or aggressive. Mm-hmm. Women in general, when they're serious, are more likely to be perceived as aggressive and angry, actually.
Mm-hmm. Which is not the case for men.
No, actually, men, it's really interesting. When you look at a woman who's scowling, or a woman who's scowling, or a woman who is neutral when you would imagine she should be positive, let's say, the assumption is that she's a bitch. Mm-hmm. When a man is scowling, the assumption is something bad just happened to him. Mm-hmm. Right? So her expression tells you something about her as a person. His expression tells you something about the state of the world. And I won't go into the the implication of that for politics, although I have in other places. I think the 2016 election was a beautiful example of this, which I actually wrote about in the New York Times. Yeah.
It's interesting that the study that, I think this is a study that you did, where you just basically replaced long hair, short hair.
So what we did was we took, this was
same face.
Yeah,
same
actually,
bitch face.
Actually, what we did was we took a male face and a female face, and we morphed them into being a very androgynous face. And then we used a computer program that one of my graduate students found called Cosmo Hair, where that should have gotten a laugh. There's a computer program, okay, anyways, where you can put male hair or female hair on the face. So we basically took this androgynous face, and which was at rest, and we just plunked, female hair on one and male hair on the other, and then we also did it for scowling, a scowling male face and female face and so on. And so sure enough, the emotional faces, when they had female hair, people were more likely to make what we call dispositional attributions, which means you make an inference about what that, the woman is expressing something because she's just a certain type of person. Whereas people were more likely to make a situational attribution about the face with the male hair, meaning that you assume that the expression is caused by something that happened in the world. And I should point out that both male and female perceivers are equally likely to make this, to have this perceptual difference.
Patriarchy is a hell of a drug.
It really is, yeah.
So Ryan.
Yeah.
So Lisa's work, particularly in the book, kind of focuses on the social construction of emotions. And your book focuses on social geography and attitudes. And I'm quite interested in that term. What do you mean by social geography?
Yeah.
And how does it affect our attitudes and eventually our behavior? And we'll talk about the election later, but in
Sure.
answering that question, how does it affect our attitudes?
Yeah. So social geography is just the arrangement of groups in space, groups on the Earth's surface. And of course, that can mean things that are really meaningful for us, like whether a city is segregated by something like race or religion or something like that, or whether a city is, even if it is segregated or unsegregated, how big the groups are that make up those places, or whether groups live close together or far apart in a country. And these are things that are very, very meaningful for how we perceive things. We can think about two different cities, one that's very homogeneous and one that's very heterogeneous, and those are often very, very different places. So this could be, for example, the difference between a place like Chicago that I focus on heavily in my book, which is a very segregated and at the same time a very diverse city, or a place that is much more integrated, a place like Los Angeles, which is still pretty segregated actually, but is much more integrated than Chicago across different groups. And I look at the difference between those cities. The question is, how does that affect our emotions? And the answer is, it seems to in a very powerful way, because our minds seem to use this segregation. They use this social geography to make us to form what we think about other groups. So they use it as a simple heuristic or shortcut in the sense that if groups are segregated, we seem to think that they're very different from each other. And this translates into things like affect, it translates into things like attitudes that even affect our behavior towards these groups, and ultimately can affect these political processes I look at in the book, things like how people vote, whether or not they support certain candidates, even whether they turn out to vote, and things like that.
So you use an example, I forgot what city, maybe it was Chicago, on the train.
Yeah.
Where you had, I guess, a train line where there were no Hispanics. Is that on the train line? And then you basically place Hispanic train passengers, had them speak Spanish, and then you kind of survey the passengers' opinions, I think, on immigration. Tell us more about that study and the results.
So, well, that was a great summary. You almost told the whole study, except you have the city wrong, which makes it more interesting, because the city was Boston. And so what we did in this study is we wanted to, we're in some ways breaking down segregation. And the idea is that when segregation creates these attitudes towards groups, what happens when you increase the salience of those groups by inserting them into people's neighborhoods, by making them relevant to people? And Boston, like a lot of cities in the United States, in the larger metropolitan area, is a place that's very segregated between Latinos and non-Latinos. And so you can ask about Latinos, people's attitudes about Latinos in things like surveys or in a laboratory or something like that. But what we wanted to do was really try to simulate this process of the breaking down of segregation by simulating a process of immigration where people are moving into somebody's neighborhood, and so they're exposed to these people in the same way over and over again. So we hired, in the language of experimentalists, we hired Confederates, meaning people that work for us. And we hired...
That's what it means?
That's what it means,
Okay.
yeah. So a Confederate, I know, it's an odd term. I didn't invent it in this case, but an experimental Confederate, somebody I hired for us. In this case, they were native Spanish speakers. And we sent these native Spanish speakers out to communities in the Boston area on the commuter rail line that were very low percent Hispanic. They're like 2.5% Hispanic in those communities. But in fact, that's actually that's the median percent Hispanic in a community in the United States. And when we live in a place like Boston or Cambridge, we tend to have a biased view of this because we live in very diverse cities. We don't realize that your typical community is not like that. And so we sent them out into these largely Anglo communities on these train lines. And the reason we use train lines is because people tend to catch these commuter rail lines at the same time every day to ride it into the city. And so when we sent them out there to these rail lines at the same time every day and had them wait there on the platform, the riders of these trains were exposed to people every day like they had moved into their neighborhood. So before or after we sent these Confederates, these Spanish-speaking Confederates out, we surveyed the riders of these trains on a bunch of stuff, but what we really cared about was their attitudes about immigration policy. And so we asked them questions like, should the number of immigrants from Mexico be decreased? should the children of undocumented immigrants be sent back to where they came from? And we even asked them if English should be the official language of the United States. And what we saw, compared to a control group, so this was a controlled trial, and we looked at this within person, what we saw was after they'd been exposed to these immigrants, these putative immigrants, for just a few days, that their attitudes moved in a sharply exclusionary direction. So they said that they wanted to send immigrants back to Mexico, or decrease the number of immigrants from Mexico, send the children of undocumented immigrants back. And they even sort of said that they wanted English to be the official language of the United States, but it turns out that most people already think that English is the official language of the United States, so you can only see so much movement on that question. But what this showed us was, I mean, first of all, it was a very policy relevant thing, because it showed us that when these communities and these places are largely not Hispanic, when they start to change, we might expect a backlash. In a certain respect, a lot of us that live in a place like Massachusetts think that we're very different from other places, that we're sort of a good liberal state, and we shouldn't have to worry about things like reacting negatively to diversity. But what we found was that these voters in this these citizens in this very liberal place, these were all people that said they'd voted for Obama, they expressed themselves as liberals, that they had this backlash when their social geography changed. And the thing we have to think about then is that if demographers are right, our social geography in this country is going to change, and we have to think about how to move things forward in a way that's not going to have that negative backlash.
This is interesting because you would think that exposure, or what people refer to as diversity or integration, be the thing that would kind of change these attitudes. So do you think it's the fear of them taking over with their presence on the train, or does diversity actually work? Does integration actually work? What is going on here? Well,
so in the way I describe it, it's a very basic cognitive process. It's the change in the salience of these groups that reminds people of their group identity. In this particular case, and when these group identities become salient, something we know from decades of social psychology is that when group identities are salient, we sort of double down on them. And this we think we're more different from the other group. We might be more likely to discriminate against them. You can see this in laboratory studies. And that spills over into political behavior. It causes us to want to do things like exclude them from our community. Now, in this particular case, of course, there's more going on than just a cognitive process, because these groups are laden with meaning. I mean, these are an immigrant group that is very salient in the United States, and it gets caught up in things like anti-immigrant rhetoric and all those kinds of things. The part of this that becomes particularly interesting is you can extend this to the real world. And so I finished this book in October 2016 and sent it off to my editor. And then in November 2016, the election happened. And I guess he said we were going to wait on politics, but I'll get to that.
No, that's my next question.
There you go. So Trump was elected, and one of the obvious, and Trump was somebody that was caught up, as we all know, in the rhetoric of anti-immigrant policies and things like that. And one of the predictions from this experiment then was that those sort of policies that he proposed would be most attractive in areas that had seen a large increase in immigration as a proportion. And so what we did is we just went and got data, and we can see this on the individual level when we look at surveys, or we can see this using aggregate data if we just look at counties and such. But you can see in these areas that saw a very quick, a very large and sudden increase in Hispanic immigration. Those were places where white voters, and in this case actually Democrats is what it looks like if you look at the survey data, voted for Donald Trump. So in some ways that's a very much a real world instantiation of what we saw in a place like Boston, in these communities around Boston, when we put these putative immigrants, these Confederates, out on the trains.
Fascinating. So let's transition to research in the public sphere.
Yeah.
So both of your work transcends the tower, not only in what is said, but in who it also talks to. You both seem to have special messages, not just for the general public, but also for specific members. So, for example, Lisa is Folks in the Courtroom. And for you, Ryan, you also have a section of the book in which you're offering suggestions for policymakers. So I want to know, what is that message to folks in the courtroom and to policymakers? And how do you craft that message in such a way that it doesn't come off as preachy advice from an academic elite? So 2 questions into one. What is that message, and how do you craft it in a way in which it doesn't sound?
Well, swearing helps.
Sounds less preachy.
Yeah,
got
very
it.
much, yeah.
Good advice.
Yeah. No, I mean, so I actually have there's more embedded in my book, I think, than just for the law. You know,
that's what I'm.
There's a message
yeah.
for teachers.
Of course.
There's a message, And people are sensitive to those messages, both pro and con, you know. But I would say, so what is the message to the law? The message is that the law, you know, the law embodies a particular theory of mind. There's a philosophy of mind that's used in the legal system. And that's necessary because, particularly for example, for criminal law, you have to infer somebody's intent and in order to judge how culpable they are for the harm that they putatively do. And in civil law, similarly, you have to know how harmful things are to people in order to know what damages to award and things like that. And the law uses a very classical view of the mind, you know, that you are a rational person, but lurking deep inside you is a lizard brain, which has to be controlled and which can cause you to do bad things. So the idea in the law, particularly in U.S. law, not so much now in some other countries, but you know that if emotion causes you to act, the assumption is you're less culpable because you had less free will, basically. So that's, you know, something we should wonder about, given the fact that from the perspective of the brain, there is no anatomical distinction between emotion and cognition. It's not like there are some parts of your brain that are for emotion and some parts that are for cognition. And in fact, you know, you were speaking about affect, which is the term that scientists use for simple feelings that basically come from your body: feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant, feeling aroused or worked up, feeling calm. These are feelings that are always with you every waking moment of your life because your brain is controlling your body. And this is how you largely experience your body. So right now, as I'm talking to you, you know, there's an orchestra of sensations occurring in your body that you are mostly unaware of. Because if you were aware of your heart pounding and your lungs expanding and the whoosh of the blood through your arteries and so on, you would never pay attention to anything outside in the world ever again, right? But the point is that there is no, if these simple feelings are with you all the time, whether you're having an emotion or not, what this means is that there's no decision that you can make that is ever free from sentiment. This is also true this is as true for you and for me as it is for a federal judge. Right? So there's also the issue of, you know, can we read emotions in other people's faces? According to the Supreme Court of the United States, we have to be able to know the heart and mind of a defendant in order to know whether he or she is guilty and what sentence is deserved. And in capital cases, which means cases where juries are making a decision between life in prison and the death penalty, research shows that this decision largely hinges on whether or not the jury believes that the defendant is remorseful. Well, how do you read remorse in a defendant? Well, you read remorse on the face, right? Just like you read all emotions, or in body language, or in vocal acoustics, except that there are very large cultural differences in how people express remorse. And there are even individual differences depending on the situation. And so there are very visible cases in US law where people appeared to be remorseful but weren't, and other cases where they actually were remorseful and there was other evidence that they were remorseful. You can't really actually say if they were or not, but there was other evidence that they were, but they didn't express remorse in a way that was typically the stereotype of Americans. So there are many, many ways that the law uses a very classical view of the mind when it's, you know, might not be warranted, and this can cause people to not to go to jail when they ought to, and to go to jail when they ought not to, or sometimes even to lose their lives. The thing to remember about the law is that it's a normative system. And when it comes to emotion, it's a normative system about what to feel, when to feel it, and how those feelings are supposed to influence your actions and therefore your responsibility for those actions.
So, okay. So you say use curse words in order to communicate this effectively so that they won't feel like it's coming from some, you know, speak academic.
Yeah, so that would be the moment where I would go, oh, I'm not going to, now that I'm feeling self-conscious about swearing, but I think the way to come across as not preachy is to try not to use jargon, and also just try to connect with these ideas. Like, I don't know, I mean, you know, I gave the example I use in my TED Talk is the example of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. And, you know, I found myself as a person being, I had a real conflict here. And the conflict for me was, I live in Boston. The Boston Marathon was a mile from those bombings occurred a mile from my office. We were in lockdown for several days while they were searching for the bombers. And we were scared shitless. We were scared out of our minds. People were scared, right? He was caught, like, I don't know, less than 2 miles from our house. And of course, all these people were really harmed in a way that was brutal and unfair. And so as a person, I'm caught up in the emotion of that. But also, I can tell you that, you know, I can't say whether he felt remorseful or not, but he comes from a culture where it's a culture of honor, where the most honorable thing you can do in defeat is to be stoic, to not cry, to not wrench your, you know, show your feelings. And so the jurors found him to be not remorseful enough, and they awarded him the death penalty. Now, I wasn't a juror, and I don't think my own personal opinions are relevant about whether or not he deserves the death penalty or whether I even believe in the death penalty. But the point is that the decision to award him the death penalty was made on an assumption that is called into question by science. And so I found myself in a situation where, as a person, I feel one thing, and as a scientist, I feel compelled to point out something else. This is also true, I will say, for the police shooting of unarmed civilians, particularly unarmed people of color. There's as a person, I might feel one thing, and as a scientist, there are other facts that have to be brought to bear that might, you know, the fact that none of us wait till we see something conclusively and then act. When you play baseball, you don't wait to see the baseball and then swing. If you did, that ball would be whizzing by your head. So, you know, in our lab, we can create a situation where people see guns where there are no guns. It's actually really easy to do. Now, when I wrote about that in the New York Times, you know, I had to be really careful and say, I'm not saying this, the fact that police officers, I'm not talking here about cases where where police officers have shot people in the back as they're trying to run away. But if somebody has a gun, if somebody has keys or a phone, and this is a person of color who is being chased as a potential assailant, police officers cannot wait until they see a gun. If they do, and that person actually has a gun, they will die. They won't be able to cock their gun and fire fast enough. It's just not physically possible. And so what this means is that, of course, I think what it means, of course, is that we should never get to the point where people are in a position where they're drawing a gun. Right? There are other things that can be done to even avoid that situation. But the point is that you know, I had to be really careful and say, this is not an alternative explanation for racism. This is one way that racism actually can express itself. But it isn't necessarily racism if somebody sees a gun when someone else has keys in their hands. It's just a scientific fact that is easily replicated in a lab, that I can just make you feel unpleasant and unnerved and create a situation where potentially there's a threat, and you will be more likely to see a keys or a phone as a gun. Now, how to talk about that in a way that is not, you know, where I'm aware of the consequences of that and what it might feel like to hear that. I could give you examples of the Me Too movement. I could give you examples of, as a scientist, the way that you don't sound preachy is you approach the topic with real sentiment. You as a person have feelings about the topics that you're writing about, but you also have to convey the science in a way that just allows people to approach you without prejudging what you're trying to say with that science, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Ryan, you have a message, if I may say, to policymakers in your book. What is that message, and how did you get around crafting it in a way in which it doesn't come off preachy?
Well, I should say I don't know if it comes off preachy or not.
No,
I hope it doesn't. But okay,
didn't
well,
mean.
fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Good. So something I try to emphasize to policymakers, and I should say as a general point, as somebody that is in a government department or a political science department, we touch on things about policy all the time, and whenever I talk about policy, I always emphasize that policy is actually really difficult. I mean, there's people whose expertise are in policy, and that's not my expertise. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a policymaker. And not only is it difficult because it's hard to know what's good and what's bad, but we all have biases around what's good or what's bad that are based on politics and lots of other things. And so I don't always know what the right policy is. But my approach as a social scientist is to say that I want to tell policymakers what I think they should be thinking about while they're making policy. Not necessarily what the outcome should be, but what they're thinking about. And so, for example, in my book, since I deal with social geography and how that affects our harmony as a society, social geography is something that's very shaped by policy. Our governments make decisions about where and how people should live. They do these things by affecting the size of housing stock and by that basically affects whether or not poor or rich people can live in a city, and by virtue of that, it affects whether different racial groups can live in a city and everything else that's correlated with wealth. And so this is something that's a very policy relevant issue. And in some ways, when we think about the harmony between groups in society, that's actually something that policymakers have very much ignored. So often when we think about whether or not people get along, especially in the United States, we think about things like contact in institutions. So we say, we're going to put children of different colors together in schools and see and try to solve intergroup relations that way. And in fact, that doesn't happen that often anymore either, but that used to be the way we try to solve it. Or we try to leave it to private institutions. We say universities will take a very select group of people and let them get together. Or we say that sometimes businesses will try to diversify and let people get together. And we let those sort of small-scale matters of intergroup contact solve our problems of intergroup relations in a country. And the point I try to make in this book is I say when we do that, we're really leaving out a huge portion of the puzzle, which is whether or not people just live together in neighborhoods, whether they live together in cities. And in fact, what we can show, based on a lot of different evidence, is even when we have contact in these institutions like schools and universities and businesses, if people still then leave those institutions and go live on one side of the city and another side of the city, that fact that they live in those other sides of the city is going to overwhelm this contact they have in those institutions. And so when policymakers don't choose to deal with that, they're really missing a huge part of the puzzle. And when I say all that, of course, I back it up to say I understand this is a difficult problem because in the United States we have values around certain things like freedom of movement, and don't want to tell people where to live and where they shouldn't live, and those things are in conflict. But we have to recognize when we choose one of those values over another, we're leading to certain social outcomes. And you asked me how I don't be preachy. Yeah, well, I think part of it is, like I said, saying that I don't know. Policies are difficult, and admitting that up front. But I think one of the things I try to emphasize as a scientist, and I think this is something that actually often the lay public doesn't understand about expertise, is really the true nature of expertise is understanding how much you don't know. And understanding the uncertainty around the things you're saying. And so I often couch things I say to say, I don't know this for sure. I don't know if this is actually true. I've got a lot of evidence to back it up, but I've got uncertainty around it. And if you think about it, that's actually a very different thing than what often somebody in politics or somebody in policy says. Somebody in politics very rarely gets up and says, oh, I don't actually know the answer. They tell you something with a great deal of certainty. And I think when somebody, the humility that can come with true expertise, I think is something that often can start a conversation off on the right foot, that allows people to say, it's okay, because this person that I'm bringing in as an expert actually is saying, well, I have a lot of uncertainty about this question.
I'm reminded that at some point I need to be answering the questions that I'm also asking of myself. So I apologize, Elise, for not doing that. But I asked the question because I struggle in my own work with not being preachy.
Yeah, we all care about things, right?
Yeah, we care about things, and I kind of take the moral philosopher license with telling people what they ought or ought not to do. But I think the way in which I try to work around it is kind of utilizing the we a lot as a way to let people know that we're in this together in some kind of way. So it's not I talking to you, telling you what you ought to do, but what we need to do together or what we need to be reminded of. So that's some way that I kind of get through it. Lisa, you were?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think that our job a little bit is to give people tools to think through hard problems a little bit better. Mm-hmm. So not to tell them what to think, no matter how much we might want to tell them about what to think. Our job isn't to tell them what to think, it's to tell them, here are the things that you might think about, some of the things you might consider that maybe you haven't considered before. And then here are some ways of thinking about it. You know, you could, and the important thing to do, I think the most successful pieces that I've done are pieces where you can't really tell from my writing what side I'm taking. Right. What side I would like to take if you knew me, actually, right? When I was speaking as a citizen and not as a scientist. So I think it's sort of the same goal as being an educator in a university, which is, when you're at your best, you're not telling your students what to think. You're teaching them a set of tools so that they know how to think better. That's really the goal. And I think the second goal is something that you mentioned, which is also to model a little bit about what it means to be a scientist, actually. Scientists make mistakes. The difference between a scientist and a politician, maybe, is that we actually try hard to make it clear when we make mistakes as fast as possible.
In theory.
In theory. But I think one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this political moment right now, frankly, is that people are not equipped to know how to use science and even to know what is good science as opposed to something else. And so it behooves us to try to not just talk about it, but model it, I think.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about, when I think about both of your books, you make use of lots of data. But you're still able to communicate an argument, communicate an idea in a way that still sounds quite interesting and fascinating. And I'm not just saying that to impress you. Like, it's pretty clear to read, pretty accessible. And I wonder if you can just help us out. For a lot of people who do work, has anything to do with psychology or social science, they have to wrestle and deal with and make sense of a lot of data. How do you craft that in a way in which it reads well and still sound interesting?
Well, I don't know what you do, but first of all, I think you have to realize you're telling a story.
Right.
So this is actually even what you do in one of your professional, in your academic papers, scientific papers. You're telling a story.
Yeah.
And so it has to be a good story. You have to know who your characters are in your story, and you have to know what kind of story you're telling, right? So if you were to talk to people who study literature, they'll tell you there are meta-narrative structures for different kinds of stories. So being a little mindful about that, I think is a good thing. And then I think the other thing for me, which was really helpful, before I wrote a book, I swore actually I would never write a popular book, but then eventually I was convinced to do it, actually for some of the reasons we talked about. But what I did first was I read a lot of popular science books. And I also read books about writing. And one of the books that I read was by Stephen King, which was a great book about writing. And one of the things Stephen King said was, have in your mind your ideal reader, the person who, this is the person you're talking to. So for him, it's his wife, right? When he's writing stories, he wants to write stories that are going to entertain his wife. And so it could be your sister, it could be your grandmother, it could be, but it has to be a civilian. In my house, when we refer to the 1%, we're talking about academics, right? And everybody else, it's, so my husband would often say to me when I was writing, and he's my ideal writer. He's not a psychologist. He's, not an academic. If he could understand what I was writing about, then I felt like I was on the right track. So I would recommend, no matter how long your pieces are short, have in mind someone who's like your litmus test. If they understand you, then you are more likely, you're on the right track to being understood, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. Excuse me, I would just say something similar, and you hear different ideas of who this ideal should be, and often the idea is that you should be able to explain this to your grandmother or something, and that probably varies depending on who your grandmother is. But I think there's a lot of truth to that, in the sense that your grandmother may not care about your particular scientific nuance of whatever you're doing and why this matters to other people in the field, but they probably care about it for the same reason that you started to care about this, which is it has some impact on your life, on society or on something you care about. And you should be able to explain in the end why this particular finding you have with all this data and whatever method you did to it has that outcome, why it affects that thing you care about, and start from that point and then work backwards and decide what it is, what are the details that you need to explain to get your grandmother to that point, understanding why this thing you showed is relevant to that.
And the last thing I would say is, and this is true whether you're giving an academic talk or a popular talk, whether you're writing for the academy or you're writing for the public, but maybe more when you're writing for the public, and that is there's a difference between what you want to say and what you think would be useful for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you want to write in a way that will engage people because it's going to be something that they can find useful or that they can connect to. That's the way that you don't, not only that's the way you get readers, that's the way you don't sound preachy, because you're trying to connect, you're trying to do what you do at a dinner party, basically, which is you have some knowledge, but you're trying to use it in a way to connect to other people. And you can do that explicitly by using your own experience, which some people do in their writing, or you can not use it explicitly. But either way, you're gonna use it, I think.
I think the other point, if I could make one more point on this, I think the other point to make when we approach this, and this is a point I think whether we're talking to a public audience or not, but you should always ask yourself as a researcher, if you can't explain something simply, whether you really understand it like you should. Because if you can't translate something into something that other people can understand, it could be that you haven't reached that level of understanding that you really should have. And this is something that I often find myself questioning, for example, when I'm teaching. That's one of the best examples about whether you really understand something or not, is whether you can explain it to an undergraduate audience or something like that. And if you can't do it in a way they understand, you may need to step back and check your own understanding about it.
Yeah, I'll just add one more. Can
Yeah.
I say a word? So, I don't know about you, but when I was an undergraduate or a graduate student, even as an assistant professor, and I was listening to someone, esteemed scientist, if I couldn't understand what they were saying, I usually assumed that I didn't understand. They were so smart that I just could not understand what they were saying. Until one day, I was talking to this very esteemed researcher about something I actually knew something about. And this stream of words came out of his mouth, and I completely did not follow a thing that he said, and I thought, he's totally full of shit. He actually is just making this up. Here's the thing, when you write for the public, people are not going to assume that there's no one will give you deference the way that you, as a professor, you imagine that your students will give you deference, which they often don't, but they are more likely to. In the real world, outside of the halls of the academy, although the academy is becoming more like the real world every day, if people don't understand you, they're just going to assume you're full of shit. They're really not going to. They will not take the time to try to figure out what you're saying. And this is an important thing for you to know if you ever want to persuade anybody of anything. It doesn't matter whether you're talking to the US Congress or you're talking to policymakers or you're talking to a grant officer or you're talking to your students. if you want them to hear what you have to say, to think about what you have to say, you have to find a way to say it in a way that is devoid of all of the crutches that we use with jargon. It's just absolutely necessary. And I'll say that it's not like you figure out how to do it and then you always do it.
Yeah.
It's a struggle.
Yeah.
There are some days when I give, I give a talk and I think it's gone really well. There are other times when I give a talk and I think that it didn't because I just wasn't clear enough,
There are some people who may assume that because doing work inside the tower is so hard, that doing anything outside of here is a breeze. I don't agree with that, but they may have that assumption.
I would say it's harder. It's harder.
I want you to go back to when you made the transition to sharing your work with a broader audience. Give us that challenge, that learning curve that you had to get around. Ryan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So something you learn in any discipline, any scientific discipline, is you learn a language, right? So you spend however many years in graduate school, 6 or 7 or whatever, learning to speak a certain way. And it's not just the nouns you use, right? It's the particular sentence structure. You do all this stuff, and you essentially learn a dialect that you go around and use. And you get used to being around certain people and speak that same dialect, and it infuses everything you do, right? So you're just used to thinking that's how people talk. And then occasionally you interact with other people and realize that's not how they talk. But when you go to do something for the public, when you go to write or when you go to give a public lecture or something, you realize that you have to unravel that certain way of speaking that you've learned and say, I need to translate this into a way that other people are going to talk. And I think that's a real struggle because you become so used to assuming that the people you're talking to understand what certain words we use, which may be perfectly simple words, but it's just to say that you're using them with a shared understanding of their meaning because you are within a certain community that is all focused on the same issue and has learned that same dialect. And undoing that and checking yourself on that is a real difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say, though, in addition to that, it's not just that you share a set of a vocabulary. So if I use the word affect, I have a set of properties in my mind that set of features I'm trying to communicate. I say the word affect, and then, only the people who know what that means get those features in their mind. Everyone else has no idea what I'm talking about.
That one is particularly confusing because it
one
means
is.
something
And
totally
people-
different to
yeah.
the public.
So the idea, for example, that affect and emotion are different things, meaning affect is a property of all mental states, including emotion, but not limited to emotion. But there's another thing I think which is harder, for me was harder actually, probably because of the topic I was dealing with, and that is that we also have assumptions about how the world works. These assumptions kind of lurk under the surface and are not talked about frequently. So for example, stories are supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's very unusual to be plopped into the middle of a story. If there's someone who's going to be a hero in a story, there needs to be a victim and also a villain. So you start to anticipate right? And so in science, one of the things that we grapple with is, or that it goes unspoken, is the assumption that, the philosophers will know what I'm talking about, is called essentialism. The idea that a category of things, people or events or instances or objects, that a category is a group of things that are similar in some way. Essentialism is the belief that the similarity is in nature and lurking under the surface. So all instances of anger are anger because they share some unseen, sometimes unknowable essence that makes them all anger. This essentialism is at the root of many problems in science and actually many problems in our society, frankly. But people do it, and we all do it to some extent, right? We all do it, and we do it in part because of how our brains are wired. But some people do it more than others. Some cultures do it more than others. We happen to live in a culture where essentialism is rampant in our understanding of the natural world. So here's an example. How many people, put your hand up if you believe that a virus is the cause of a common cold? Most people will put their hand up in a room. You guys are being cautious because you know there's a trick lurking in here somewhere.
Yeah.
But here's a piece of evidence, though. If you take 100 people and you sequester each one in a hotel room where you control everything they have access to, and you play, including what they eat and how much they sleep, and you place a virus in their nose, somewhere between 20 and 40% of them catch a cold, develop a cold. Sorry?
I said that doesn't falsify the claim.
It absolutely falsifies the claim because of how I phrased the statement. What it means is that a virus is a necessary but not sufficient condition for developing a cold. A virus is not the cause of a cold. No, you say it like that, but that's the point, actually. The point is that we tend to think about things as being having simple, single causes. This is a problem when, in fact, there are multiple causes. And, in fact, usually there are multiple causes of the same outcome. When you're trying to understand how the brain works, when you're trying to understand how the brain makes emotion or makes memories or controls your actions or anything like that, you have to basically throw essentialism out the window. You can't throw it out the window until you call it into question to begin with. You have to bring it up. But if you do that, then people feel like they're reading a textbook. So how do you deal with these issues, right? Essentialism isn't the only example, but there are these underlying assumptions about how the world works that a really good science book will have to cause you to question, right? You need to sort of peel back the curtain, so to speak. And I think that, for me, that was the trickiest thing, was trying to figure out how to bring up these issues and make people aware of them and give them an aha moment, as opposed to making them feel like they're reading a textbook, which, that would just be an undesirable outcome.
So one final question before we go to Q&A. What has been one of the most rewarding experiences of sharing your work with the general public? And how best can we share our academic work? I guess I'll try to answer so I can get points for answering a few of the questions. I don't know, I think when I hear that someone understands the work and they get the argument and the normativity of at least what I'm trying to convey, that's rewarding for me. But I think the most rewarding, this may be a very academic joy, but I remember doing a talk and a young lady comes to me and she says, I was listening to your podcast while I was working in a factory. And by listening to the podcast, it was I guess, knowledge for me that there are people doing the kind of work that I can actually do. So I applied to grad school. And now she's a second-year PhD student at Columbia University because she listened to the podcast. So that has been one of the most rewarding experiences. Ryan, what has been your most rewarding experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll tell you what is often not rewarding until I think about it is when you write about things like policy and politics is getting criticized from both sides of things. I always say when I write, I learned that like reading comprehension, a lack of reading comprehension, is a bipartisan problem. But you learn to let that go. But I think these more interpersonal experiences, that when you are lucky enough to have somebody say that they read something that inspired them in some ways, are really valuable. The other day I heard from one of my old undergraduates, it wasn't totally the public that was just random out there, but somebody who's connected to me was praising my book and said he read it, but the part that I found really valuable was that he said he'd gone to the bookstore and bought a copy for his grandmother, going back to grandmothers again. And it was the fact that he thought it was meaningful enough, that it talked about something that was important enough, that he wanted to send it to somebody that was important to him. And that really touched me, both because it's somebody that I knew from my past, it was one of my undergraduates, but that he thought that it was something, of all the things he could send his grandmother, that was something he wanted to send to her. that idea when things get out and you know that people are sending them to people that you think are important, I think it's a real marker that people have found value in what you've done.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer this without, I don't want to, I mean, I don't know how to answer this without sounding, I don't want to sound like I'm sort of patting myself on the back, but
I just kind of sort of patted myself on the back.
well, but that, right, but
Or you patted me, or?
yeah, well.
It's a
but
self-patting question.
Self-patting question,
Self-patting
but
question.
I do actually receive on a fairly regular basis emails from people saying, this book changed my life. And then they tell me a story about some way in which it changed their life. Like, you know, it saved them from killing themselves. Or in one case, a guy who was in the war and almost shot somebody by mistake. Or, and you know, and it's plagued him for 30 years, right? Or just recently, actually just this week, someone emailed me, you know, there are some things in the book that people on the right of the political spectrum take issue with, and they think I'm being kind of a cultural warrior in certain places because I'm just talking about some really inconvenient biological evidence, you know. And so I've received a lot of hate mail on occasion, and so this person sent me a very nasty note full of really ugly things. And so I did what I often do now, which is I emailed back and said, I don't respond to these kinds of insults, but if you actually have a question and you ask me in a polite way, I will answer you.
Did you get a response?
He did. He actually answered me in a very polite way and said what his concern was. And so then I took the time to answer him back, a very long, involved answer, which I apologize. Like, I apologize for the long answer, but you wanted the, you know, so this is the, here's the answer. And then he emailed, and what ensued really was a conversation which ended up with him telling me that this was one of the first experiences he had with a professor who talked to him like a person, basically, and listened to what he had to say. And I felt like I had just done a really good thing. Like, I had an opportunity to do something that I would not maybe otherwise have had. So I think for me, like for everyone, right, that it's that you touch individual people's lives. It's great when you, it's a great feeling when you, what you write has a policy implication or gets people in the government or in the law or in medicine to start having a different conversation. That's really great. But it's really meaningful when you see evidence that somehow something that you've said has given someone comfort or helped them do something brave that they otherwise couldn't have done or felt they couldn't have done, or in some ways just helped in some way. That's I know it's a corny thing to say, but that actually is that is the most meaningful thing, I think.
For those who want to have or hope to have kind of similar rewarding experiences, what is the best medium that you suggest for them to share their work? I would recommend podcasts as something that someone can do, just buying minimum equipment and uploading to iTunes, and so don't have to worry about getting accepted by an editor. That would be my suggestion. What would be your suggestion, Lisa Lyon? And then we'll take questions.
I'm a little loath to recommend it, but you can touch a lot of people on Twitter. I mean, you can't share complex things on there, but it's really a way to be involved in public conversations. And a lot of my sort of early forays into public notice of my work was because journalists and such were following me on Twitter. And
Brian, just to be clear, do you post 140 plus characters of your work, or do you post links to your work, or how do you?
I post links to my work,
okay.
and I post links to other people's work too, because I see part of my role as saying there's people that have expertise, this random thing that people are arguing about out there. There's people that have expertise, going back to what we should be telling people, that tell you what you should think about this, to try to inform you. So I try to point people towards my work and other people's work, and that starts a lot of conversations, and often I get journalists love Twitter, and they probably too much, and they seem to. I get a lot of direct messages from journalists and such to say, I saw you talking about something on Twitter, can you tell me more about that? And then often that will end up in a conversation in a newspaper or something like that.
I don't know that I would say I don't like the question.
It's fine.
Yeah, I think that I think there isn't a best way. Or maybe the best way is to do as many different mediums as possible. So if you want to get a message out, if you want people to think about something differently, or you just want them to think about something that they're not thinking about, then some people you're going to reach with Twitter, some people you'll reach with a podcast, some people you're going to reach with a blog post, some people you're going to reach by giving a talk. My feeling about it is, if you really want a message, then you have to say it many times in different ways, in different mediums, so that people, if you only say it once in one way, some people might hear you, but it's not going to reverberate. If you look to cultural anthropology, what you see is that how do innovations catch on, right? And innovation, I think this is actually true in science, although they're not writing about science. They're writing about, tools and things. Innovation catches on. There are many, many conditions that have to be set right in order for an innovation to catch on. And one of the conditions is that you have to touch a lot of people, and you have to do it in a way that you have some authority, meaning not that you're the boss, but meaning that you're credible, that you have to be a credible source. And so, for example, I'm much more credible, I think, in writing than I'm getting better on Twitter.
It's not something to be proud of, trust me.
But so I think you have to sort of speak to your own strengths. So for you, podcasting is a strength.
I have several strengths, but yes.
Yeah. Well, I said a strength, not the strength. A strength. And I think, but a podcast, in my experience, some podcasts work out well. Some are, if you're the guest, how well you do to some extent depends on the kinds of questions that your host asks you. And if they're not asking questions that will let you eke out your point in bits and pieces so that you can bring people along with you, you're going to have a hell of a time. So I would say, I think diversify the same way you would diversify a financial portfolio. That's what I try to do, as opposed to pick one and kind of go with that.
Well, thank you. So we're going to take some questions. Some mics going around here.
Thank you so much for the talk. I just have a quick question about.
Speaking of Mike Darian.
Oh, my bad. So I just want to go back to this, to the case of perception of the gun perception thing. Just because I think a lot about it, I read a lot of studies on it. So I guess the question is, do you make a distinction between cognitive bias, so just roughly defined like shortcuts and like brain activity, like that everyone has, and this very special kind of bias that people seem to talk about in terms of like implicit bias or implicit attitudes, which is roughly defined, I would say, as background mental states informing perception, or some people call it cognitive penetration, some people call it concept latedness. And so I'll let you answer that, but then I guess the second part of the question is, assuming that there is a real distinction between cognitive bias, something that all subjects have, and implicit bias, which is socially conditioned on particular subjects. In the case of perceiving like weapons perception, I took it that from the implicit bias model, what people are saying is like not the cognitive bias claim that everyone, like that's how I interpret you as saying like everyone is susceptible to do this, which is I totally accept that. But I thought what those studies were trying to get us at is how people are more prepared, or the readiness people have because of background mental states about let's say black people or Arab people, or whatever. That's what we were trying to get at with the implicit attitudes research, is the preparedness or the readiness to shoot of a particular group. even if everyone has a kind of shortcut and we make messy judgments out of brain heuristics. So this is a two-part question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just say that the research on, there really is really not enough research on implicit bias. There's a lot of research on implicit attitudes, not so much on implicit bias, not as much as we might like. So I sat on a National Science Foundation panel for 3 days, basically trying to adjudicate the literature on implicit bias and implicit attitude. So I'm familiar with that literature. From a computational standpoint, if we think about how the brain works, there's no difference between implicit attitudes and cognitive heuristics. Right. So from a computational standpoint for how the brain works, here's what your brain is doing. Your brain doesn't react to things, it predicts things. Your brain is anatomically structured to predict. It's using past experience to make a prediction about what's going to happen next. So every attitude that you have, right, whether you can speak about it or not, if you can speak about it, it's explicit. If you don't, it's implicit. Every attitude that you have is conditioned on your exposure, right? So here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the way that vision works, it's not that you something presents itself to your retina and then you perceive it. Your brain, right now, if we could just freeze time, what you see right now is your brain is now using that and what you hear and what the temperature is like and what the state your body's in and all, it's using all that information to predict what you're going to see next in the next moment. And that's true just because of how your brain is wired. Now, what it is that your brain prepares you to see is, so those statistical contingencies that your brain is using is absolutely culturally conditioned. And so, but here's the thing. What this means is that that people, even if they don't score, even if they don't score poorly on the race IAT, may still be, which doesn't mean that they don't have implicit bias. The IAT is a great measure, but it's just one measure, right?
It's actually awful.
I'm sorry?
I actually think it's kind of bad.
It's a great measure for some things, and it's not a great measure for other things. I mean, that's a longer conversation. But for whatever, my point is that we all have implicit attitudes that are conditioned on cultural learning, that are wired into our brains because we have baby brains, little infant brains are not miniature adult brains. They are brains that are waiting to be wired by their environment. And we are, as a species, one of our major adaptive advantages is that our culture, our interactions actually are ingrained in our young people, right? And so I think the point actually that I would make is that while some people may be more likely to draw that, I mean, some people may be more likely to get into a position where they have to draw a gun. Right. That would be my point, actually. But that everybody is, the process is the same. The content is not the same for everyone, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Christine. Just going back to the conversation about emotions in the courtroom, what you said about defendants not looking remorseful when that's really either people projecting something or expecting people's faces and bodies to look in a certain way to mean remorse. I'm just wondering, in your view, what would an alternative legal system look like? What would an alternative criminal justice system look like?
Yeah, so this is the part where normally what I would say, which is what you say when you're talking to policy people, I make it really clear. I mean, I do speak to lawyers and judges on a fairly regular basis as part of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital. And what I want to say is I am not a legal scholar. I am not a legal scholar. And my job really, it would be preposterous for me to tell you what I think a legal system should look like. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a judge. I'm just a scientist. So I can't really, I make it really clear that it's not my job to tell people what things should look like. It's only my job, as you said very nicely, to tell them the kinds of things that they need to be thinking about when they make those decisions. But I will say this. As a scientist and also as someone who recently served on a jury, right? So normally, for my whole adult life, I've never served on a jury because I'm a scientist. I have a degree in clinical psychology and I'm a neuroscientist. Nobody wants me on a jury. But for some reason, I got put on a jury and I was traumatized by what I saw. I never want to be in a position in this country ever where I am tried by a jury of my peers. And I understand exactly what I'm saying here, right? I understand exactly what I'm saying. I'm calling into question one of the foundational aspects of this country's legal system. I'm not saying we should abandon jury trials, but I do think some serious thought has to be given to how jury trials are run in this country. But I can't, I'd love to answer your question, but I just don't, I'm not really smart
I think
enough.
you've answered it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, thank y'all for a wonderful conversation. Let me see if I can put this in some sort of way that y'all can understand. I've been thinking a lot about silence lately. So this is kind of for all three of you, particularly in this room. I think it was 1884, The Atlantic publishes an article called The Negro Problem by a gentleman named Nathaniel Shaler, who we find on this wall back here. And for the time since, black folk have been trying to get out of the language of the Negro problem, this, that, and the other. Now, I think that he intended the article to do something that it ended up not doing. Part of that has to do with his expertise as a social scientist in a time where social science research is really, really innovative and on the cutting edge of things. So how do we as academics, as people with expertise in things, how do we decide when to be quiet and when not to write something that our expertise might contribute to a dialogue? And how do we think about that in terms of audiences? If we're thinking about writing for a particular audience, the consequences of the article that we're aiming to write doesn't necessarily fall on that audience. It falls on people outside of that audience. So how might we, as up-and-coming writers or hopeful writers, think about this in our decision-making process on whether or not to weigh in on a subject?
I mean, I can offer some thoughts, and I wish I had a really clear answer for you, but I don't. But something I say quite often, and this goes back to some of my comments I made earlier, that I think one of the most important qualities of a scientist is humility. Yeah, to understand how often we're wrong and to be very careful about what we say. Now, of course, that's very much in conflict with the reason we're here, to talk about how to get things out in the public sphere. So there's that tension there, but we can see a lot of examples where science goes wrong. There's an example in my discipline that we're still dealing with to this day, where somebody published a very bad article that claimed there was about something, I'm just shooting the numbers in the dark here, but it was something like 15% of non-citizens in this country voted illegally. And it was a terribly false claim. It was very easy to falsify. But this person not only published this, and it would have sort of gone to sleep in the academic journals because nobody believed it, but went out and wrote all these pieces about it. And to this day, we're still like, when court cases are being litigated and there's a sort of Trump voter fraud commission, they're relying on the single piece of evidence that never should have been put out there. And so one question would be, how do we not be that person? How do we not make that claim that is so damaging and that people are, still affecting people to this day, still wasting all these resources and causing all these things? And I'm not exactly sure on that, but I think the processes of always reminding ourselves about that humility, where we check our things with our peers, and we ask, we accept that we're fallible, and we want to know, is this the right claim to make? And should I be certain enough that I'm going to amplify it? And all those things are things we should constantly be checking ourselves on. And I guess I'll say one more thing about that, though. The reason this is a very good question, and the reason it's difficult, is often, as academics especially, we're put in these situations that allow us to forget about that aspect of humility. You know, this is like, you know, for myself, I become a Harvard professor, and like everybody goes around and tells me how great I am all the time and stuff like that, and it's so it's a really a reason to get a big head, right? And like, and that's very dangerous to science. So those things run counter to each other. And we have to be really careful to how to know to separate those things. I mean, we shouldn't get a big head at all, but assuming we do, we need to know how to separate it from that prospect, or that process of putting things in the public eye.
I wanted to answer it coming from the humanities, because I think there's a different kind of temptation. I think in some humanity disciplines, one thinks that they can have an opinion on a variety of issues. And particularly in our era in which so much is being said as far as opinion is concerned, and the desire to contribute to that conversation can be addictive and time-consuming. And so women to know that this is not the time to speak, even if your opinion piece is 500 words and it doesn't require extensive data. And one of my mottos is, I mean, from a very basic standpoint, I only respond to what is my research area. But I think another thing that allows me to kind of figure out when I am to write an op-ed is this motto that I have, is that I only speak when spoken through. And what I mean by that, it's only when the issue, I can't sleep at night, it's all I think about, the ideas are flowing, and I want to get it out through me. That's when the time is to write. When that doesn't happen, I ought to be silent and learn from everybody else.
Yeah, no, it's okay. We can go to the next one.
So I half formed the question in my mind. We'll see. Thinking of your work that you talked about specifically, and I feel like you're troubling our essential ideas of reading emotions, how do they arise, and how they can be known, and using a lot of biological language, neuropsych language, and essential ideas of agency and the one who has an emotion, and rationality versus emotion seem to be underlying a lot of our criminal procedures. And so demonstrating remorse or lack of remorse, whether that remorse is like truthful or like inherently real or not. I guess I'm just wondering how you see your research and these kind of ideas that are troubling our essential notions, how they can affect our models of justice. Currently it seems like we have a punitive model that seems to try to find some person who is ultimately responsible for these things. And it's interesting to hear how some of this neuropsych research can be used to absolve people of, or in the sense of a police officer using the sort of process that you laid out to like separate themselves from the issue, and you talk about biological, psychological processes going on. And then it can be used in the opposite way. So I'm wondering how you think your research can affect our ideas of justice and maybe advance our criminal justice system in a way that's more humane.
Humane, yeah. So, so this is, I think this is a, I think you just touched on the essential sort of, I could use that word, dilemma, right? That actually in the courts now, people are trying to use biological language biological findings to absolve people. And that's actually something, one of the reasons why I got involved in the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior was because that's just not acceptable way of using science. It's not an acceptable way of using science because the way that neuroscience is used in the classroom, in the courtroom, or genetics is actually not justifiable. It's just not justifiable. So, you know, frankly, if a police officer attempted to use predictive coding, which is what it's called, to you know, as a defense, it'd be very easy to poke holes in that from a scientific standpoint. I don't think, I mean, the book is talking about emotions as social constructions, but it's also talking about them as biological constructions. And those two are not at odds with each other, which is the interesting thing. This book actually gives a biological underpinning to social construction, frankly, which actually authenticates it in some people's eyes when it wasn't before. I'm not saying it shouldn't have been. I'm just saying, you know, its authenticity doesn't depend on biology, but some people, it convinces them, right? So here's what I would say. I think that generally speaking, we don't know enough about how the brain works to control behavior to ever use it in a court of law. And everything that we study is studied at a group level. And so that bears no implication on an individual person. I mean, we don't know how to go from making an inference about a group to making an inference about a person. So my job is sort of twofold when I'm talking to lawyers and judges and so on. And for me, this is a social justice issue, right? I don't get paid for doing this. It's completely free. I don't charge. And I never serve, actually, as an eyewitness. I never do eyewitness testimony. I don't allow myself to be hired in that way. For exactly this reason. My job is to say what the limits of the science are, and for it to be used in a beneficial way where possible. So for example, we know that solitary confinement is tantamount to torture in the Geneva Convention. It's very damaging to put someone in solitary confinement for a long period of time. And that's something that neuroscience is very, very clear on, I think, right? The kind of damage that can be done. That's I think, a punitive model at its best. And so for example, the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, is concerned about things like that, or things like the adolescent brain. So there have been decades where adolescent boys usually are convicted to life in prison when they were adolescents as a crime. Well, now that we know something about the development of the brain, and particularly what an adolescent brain looks like and how it functions in this kind of environment that we've created, right? Some of those are being overturned, or they're being revisited, those judgments. So I think, I guess what I would say is, in those kinds of cases, what you're doing is you're setting a policy based on group level research. You're not applying research to individual cases, like, oh, this guy had a tumor, so he shouldn't be, found guilty, or this person shouldn't be put in solitary confinement because he had a bad experience. No, nobody should be put in solitary confinement, and it's bad for everybody. No adolescent should be sentenced to life in prison because of the state of their brain. So I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but what I'm trying to say is that there are places for science in the legal system, but it's not in the way that the average lawyer necessarily or defendant necessarily wants to use it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, this kind of research and some other things I've read about rationality and looking at what's going on in the brain when people make decisions and decisions they think they make, I feel like just really problematize all of our ways of thinking of agency.
Yeah. Rationality is a feeling.
Right.
This whole idea that, the brain is a battleground, the mind is a battleground between rationality and feeling is just a myth. It's a really potent myth, but it's a myth from a biological standpoint, which doesn't mean that, some of your actions are planful and some of your actions are pretty automatic. But the automatic ones are not more emotional, and the planful ones are not more cognitive or more rational. That's a myth. That's just a myth. It's a really old myth. It's powerful and potent, but it's a myth.
We'll take two more questions here and there.
When it comes to the construction of emotion, I'm thinking about the distinctions, and I'm wondering if you make these distinctions with respect to how you relate it to an academic audience versus a general population, particularly because of the importance of beliefs about emotion. In science, I study emotion. I'm in clinical psych, I've done neuroscience, so we have some things in common. We are trying, some of us, to get at the essence of that emotion. And we've talked about your theories in all of these classes, and that's our core interest. But that doesn't address the implications of how we believe these emotions are expressed or should be expressed, or how malleable or not they are. So when you're speaking to the general public, do you focus more on the implications of our beliefs about them, or what these emotions at their core are, biologically or socially, or what have you? Does that make sense? Or is
Sure,
that
it does. So usually what I do, and my guess is this is what you do when you're talking about geography, the importance of geography, is you start by introducing people to their beliefs, but without pointing a finger, you know. And there are interesting ways that you can do that, by analogy, by example, by actually having them do something that reveals their beliefs to them. And so, as a general rule, I don't, in a talk to the public, I will use slides because I like to use images of things. But most of my slides have fewer than 5 words on them, maybe. I would say that's also true of my academic talks. I don't use slides with a lot of words. I use a lot of images, and I use a lot of like illustrations and things like that. But I think most people in an academic audience don't want to know why they should care about this academic work. They don't want to know how this is relevant for their own personal life. What little nugget of knowledge can you take home and change your life with it? That's what a public audience wants to know. So I'm gentler with public audiences. With a public audience, I'll usually gently introduce them to their own beliefs and then knock them over, actually invite them to do it with me, and then we all have just a rocking good time doing it. And then I kind of give them the general gist of what I think is actually going on and what we can be pretty certain about given what we know and what we have no clue about, and you know. But when I'm talking to an academic audience, I'm very data heavy, and I'm more likely to smack somebody across the face with data, I would say. That's probably the modal experience people have in my talks. I don't try to convince anybody of anything. I don't really care whether my colleagues believe me or not, but I just want them to be aware of the data, and they can make their own judgments for themselves. Yeah.
All right, we'll take our last question there.
So this question is about data, I guess. So it kind of leads into it. So as scientists, you were both alluding to the fact that you want to keep your opinion or your sentiments out of your work, and you want to let the facts speak for themselves. And you know, a lot of journalists do the same thing. But for me, like I kind of want to know where you stand, and then I want the same argument. So at least I know where that implicit bias or sentiment is coming from. So my question to you, I guess, is when you're collecting data, how do you ensure that you're not letting your bias or sentiments affect the data that you're collecting, other than going to colleagues that share the same sentiments as you do and say, hey, you know. So that's my question.
And it'll be different because both of you all, of course, have different methodology with collecting data, so it'll be interesting to hear from both of you all on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my responses would be I hope I didn't say that I try to keep my opinion out of things, because in a certain respect, I think, and this recognizes your question, that's really impossible, you know. And there's whole models of scientific reasoning that tell us this, right? I mean, we have priors and we update them, and that's what happens. We have to recognize where our priors are when we update things, and in a certain respect, that's a very valuable model of science, is to understand we come in with an understanding of the world, and we hopefully let the data update on that. Now, your very valuable question, of course, is how do we know what data we're seeking out, right? That we're not seeking out in a way to just confirm our prior beliefs. And especially, you know, in a lot of fields, this can be a real problem, in the sense that, like, you know, the one study we talked about was this study I did on these trains, and in some ways that had a lot of things that held against me just confirming my priors, because I was able to make it a double-blind experiment, and it was double-blind, and that takes away a lot of those things. But in a lot of the stuff you see, for example, in a lot of laboratory sciences, a lot, you know, social psychology, a lot of stuff that political scientists do, is not double-blind at all. And so, you know, we can lead to these problems of confirmation bias and a lot of other things. And so, you know, and I think it's easy to forget that. And so sort of trying to build in these practices that we know can guard against that can be really helpful. But to take it even a step further, and just to reaffirm that you have a good question about this, a lot of the data that I deal with, for example, is found data. It's data that exists in surveys, it's data that we just go out and collect about the world, and there's a lot of picking and choosing about what you're going to collect. And how are you going to interpret that? And how to stay away from certain interpretations of it is a real difficult problem.
Yeah. I think it's an excellent question. Just to follow that, I think it's a really important question. And I would say to you a couple of things. First of all, the scientific method was invented in the 11th century to guard against confirmatory bias, actually. So we definitely, but there's we humans, our brains are wired in a sense for confirmatory bias. But here's the problem with science, right? The problem with science is that you are setting up controlled conditions and then you're observing with whatever tools you have available, which means you can't see everything. And to some extent, your tools sometimes let you see only the things that you expect, which is a problem. I think everybody who takes science seriously knows this and understands that the enemy is within to some extent. If you want to really figure out what's going on. So we do a couple of things. One is we also use I wouldn't say found data, but data we don't collect. So we've published a number of meta-analyses using hundreds of studies involving thousands of subjects that were conducted by people who believe in the classical view of emotion. They designed those studies with confirmatory bias, and they analyze their data with confirmatory bias, and they still don't show what they predict. I think that if you think anger is a thing, and you keep trying to, you don't try to capture it in all of its variability, but you're considering only what you would consider to be like the stereotypic anger response in a European American middle class person, and that's your study, and you still can't find a physical fingerprint, and there's still tremendous variability that's contextually driven. I think that that's pretty good evidence that that theory is wrong. It doesn't tell you what hypothesis is right. It just tells you have to do something different. So part of what we do, we always begin by doing a meta-analysis or looking at evidence that's existing in the literature already and trying to analyze it in a way that is actually less supervised, that's more, doesn't take a side. That's one thing. I think the second thing that you can do as a scientist is that you don't have a single set of priors, actually. So one thing that you do is you hold competing hypotheses. You design your experiment so that you can at least test two things against each other. Well, if this is, if this hypothesis is right, then the results should look this way. If this hypothesis is right, then the results should look this way. You're not always testing things in comparison to random or a null hypothesis. That, for no other reason, what it does is it dislodges you from your own priors. And I think the third thing that you do is you pay attention to your own affective, there's that word again, but your own affective responses when you're reading something or you're designing something. If you read something, you read a study and you think, I love that study, it's an amazing study, or you think, that study is a piece of shit, you know, in both cases, that whatever that study is doing, it's touching a deeply held belief that you have. That's either supporting that belief or it's violating that belief. And that should reveal you can use your own affective feelings as a kind of clue to unmask your implicit beliefs. Does it always work? No, of course not. But it's a really good start. And then the final thing that I do is we assign people in our lab to actually take opposite views. If you asked me to stand up here and defend the classical view and tell you why it's right, I could do it. And depending on who I'm arguing against, I might even win the debate. I don't believe it, but I could argue it, right? The point is that you can, in your own laboratory, foster an environment of where you are rewarding people for asking super critical questions and avoiding groupthink. And there's a whole, I think there's a whole way of mentoring students and developing a lab culture that allows people to be super critical of each other in a way that doesn't feel hostile and is for exactly the purposes of everybody wants to be put through their paces before they go live with their results into the world, whether it's a regional conference or it's on national television. And that you have to have a group of people who can protect you from your own worst self, in a sense. So it's useful to have people that who can challenge you, like authentically challenge you. Some of my best friends believe in the classical view. And I have to be able to argue with them and convince them that a study is worthwhile. So there are lots of safeguards, I think, that you can build in so that you're not just merely confirming your own deeply held beliefs.
So we would like to thank you for your time, attention, and your questions. And also thanks once again to our panel.